Yeah.
Been living in here 40 years. I do, been doing solar energy, but also I studied
Hey.
philosophy of
Oh, I'm good.
politics for a
How are
long
you?
time. And,
Yeah, you hanging in there?
pathogens.
I'm glad you came. I would think this may make some sense for you to be here. Okay, good.
The trio.
How's the start of the semester treating you? Good?
Trio.
All right, good.
Training, research, and education.
You know, for you, this is just, it's all old news anyway, right?
Fact of the matter is, Dr. Farber spent a couple of years using the trio center to teach his foreign students over in Did you remember Dr. Farber?
Yeah, I was, he gave me, I was the last person to get awarded to the Solar Hall of Fame. He gave me the trophy for it.
Is that right?
I was one of his, say, his son's company I worked for a long time, and outside of the university on a lot of solar projects I worked. And every now and then he'd get somebody from that project you're talking about.
Yeah.
Let's just say that the person wasn't academically inclined.
Yeah, right. I know what you mean. Well,
He would ask me to take them out with my crews and show them how to install and put stuff. In other words, practical working in the field sort of things. And so they would
well, you know,
they would come along with me and my crews and actually watch us work and do real work.
I don't remember how many there were, but he had several years that they would bring people from foreign countries. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and some of them, like I said, I don't mean to besmirch them, but they weren't.
They didn't choose the person in their home country that should have come.
Well, I don't know how they got here, but let's just say they weren't academically. But they could do. You could show them how to use tools and install solar and put stuff and train them practically.
He had a couple of people that he really wanted to keep. They said they came here from that country, not for America. They got through that program.
You know, he was the only man who fought in both the German Army and the American Army in World War II. He was Austrian. Yeah, and he told me he learned English by watching American movies again and again and again. When World War II happened, you know, Germany had taken over Austria, right? Yeah. Well, he was in the Austrian Army. Part of it, they were taking in, he was the group that were invading Poland. He decided right away he didn't like the Nazis.
Well, that's good.
Well, that's going on my story. So they let him have leave, go back home after it was over with Poland. And instead of going back home, he took off for Norway. He got to Norway and told me he was the last ship out of Norway before the Nazis invaded and stopped anybody else from going. He went to, got a job at St. Louis at Washington University. He ended up as a scout tank at Patton's Army. He told me a lot of stories about there. He said one time he was somewhere in the scouts and some colonel was telling him the guys to go a certain place. You know how Farber was. He'd tell you what he thought. It didn't matter.
Yeah.
He basically cussed the colonel out and said, no, we ain't, they got 88s. I know what those 88s will do. You know what I'm referring to? It was a type of German artillery piece. It was originally designed to use it as in any aircraft gun, but it's known to be just unbelievable for destroying tanks because it could shoot so flat.
Well, it was one of those bigger ones.
Oh, yeah.
But Germany wanted something big. That was something like that. They built a bigger tank and bigger anything. But I have friends that
This particular one was also used in some of the Tiger tanks. But, you know, he knew they'd get slaughtered at times. He pretty much told the colonel, you know, they'd get slaughtered if they went this way, whatever it was, 88.
Well, you know,
You know, the thing that sort of upset a lot of people, because everybody respected him in the solar industry. You know, I've been in the solar industry since everybody really respected him. Everybody really felt like they owed a debt to him. And, you know, when he had his funeral and died, people didn't even know about it until 2 weeks later. He didn't even let there be an announcement in the papers about 2 weeks later, yeah. And it's just a little, it wasn't a big column, and it was like, you know, I was one of the few people in Gainesville to say, notified the solar. It's like he didn't want to be any big puff or puff, I guess. Well, what happened, he was always, he could have had the sole solar energy center here at the University of Florida. But he didn't believe in the fact that he believed it should be a part of different departments. It should be a quote solar energy, it should be a part of mechanical and electrical. And well, he wouldn't sell out to that concept, so went to Central Florida, and now first it was near Cape Canaveral, and then it moved down to Cocoa, and eventually they've just sort of got down to solar energy now. They don't even have anything to do with it.
well, I know about that because either the same year or the year after that, I got to build the trio center. That's actually less than a year. Finally used the center for construction.
Yeah. I knew where the energy park was, where his energy park was.
You know what? We get the veteran memorial on Tower Road.
Yeah.
If you go due east from there, about 3/4 mile, that mile away from the creek.
Oh, I know where that is, yeah.
Across the street from there, there's a trio center. It's not academic, but I know where the first place we had we had a pretty good sized facility, but we didn't have enough people to use the size. So they had storage and everything, created a building, a couple of offices, and a big shop area. We had a shop as well.
What's your name again? Where do you live now?
Well, I live in the village of West End, out in the golf course.
Oh, I know where that is.
We're downsized. I lived for moved in from home at the University Acres in 1970. And that's back to the North Florida region. North Florida region.
Gosh, I'm gonna cut this off. I'm glad this rain. I'll cut it off.
10 minutes later, we go.
Gotta cut this off.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here. I'm David Colburn with the Bob Graham Center. We have a special treat this evening. Okay, let's try that one more time. We have a special treat for you this evening. We have Jason Altmire, former 3-term congressman from the state of Pennsylvania, a Florida State University graduate. You'd be kind to him now. And he's written a book called Dead Center. Jason was known in Congress for somebody who liked to work across the aisle with both parties. And that work that he did, he has brought to fruition with this book on Dead Center. We're going to have him speak for 30 to 35 minutes, and then we're going to open up to questions. If you'll come to the mic, we would appreciate it. And we'd also appreciate it if you turn off your cell phones. The speech and the questions are all streamed so that people at home that are tuning in can hear this presentation quite well. And so that's why we ask you to come and speak to, address the mics to get a conversation going with Jason. So with that, let me say, Jason, please come and join us. And thanks for being here.
Thank you all. They turn the mic on?
appreciate you not booing the FSU reference. It's awesome to be here. I love the work that is done here at the Bob Graham Center. I talk about it in the book. In the last chapter of the book is solutions. And I think that the work that is done here is a solution. It's a long-term solution by encouraging students to be more civic-minded, more active in their communities. This is the audio guy. And I value the work that you do. So thank you for inviting me to be here. And thank you for coming, people in the community. And I have some longtime friends here, the Flags. It's really awesome to see you guys, people I've known for almost 30 years now. And when I was in office, I represented a district in western Pennsylvania. I served 3 terms from 2007 to 2013. And I had the northern suburbs of Pittsburgh, which was the affluent, kind of wealthy communities, 146 towns across the district. And the other half of the district was the blue-collar, kind of steel town, rust belt areas that you might think about along the rivers, bordering Ohio and West Virginia. So when you think of western Pennsylvania, you might think about those kind of areas. But they were very different. And they both trended towards the center. I had conservative Democrats and pro-business, anti-tax Republicans, not far-right Republicans, but more business-oriented Republicans. And they both trended towards the center, but they were very different. Now, most districts in the Congress are not like that. Most districts are solidly Republican or solidly Democrat. So when those members of Congress go home, they hear one thing. They hear, right on. Keep doing what you're doing, and don't you dare compromise. But that's not what I heard. I heard 2 points of views. When you have these swing districts, which there's about 80 in the country right now. Out of 435 seats, there's about 80 that are legitimately voting for either party. I had the benefit of hearing different points of views, and I would take that with me back to Washington. But what you find is the people who represent those other districts, they're only hearing that one side of things, and they're only hearing that one point of view. So when they come to Washington and they hear somebody on the other side, it's a foreign concept to them. They can't believe it because they don't know anybody who thinks that way. And I used to have a tagline when I was first running for Congress is, you're not going to see me go on the floor and ask my leadership how to vote. I'm going to vote the way my district wants me to vote. And that plays pretty well with the general election audience. What you find is the people who vote in primaries are people who are on the extremes. And over time, that concept doesn't resonate very well with that group because they want you to vote the way your party votes, regardless of you're on the right or the left. So that becomes a problem. And the fundamental issue that we have, well, I should tell you this to give you a sense of my voting record when I was there. During my time in office, the National Journal, which is a nonpartisan publication, which after every session of Congress ranks members based upon the previous session's votes. So they'll take 80 to 100 of the most significant votes on which there was a difference of opinion between the parties, and they will rank them from 1 to 435, most liberal to most conservative. And I was ranked number 218, which is the dead center. That's why my book is called Dead Center. I was exactly in the middle. I had the most centrist voting record in the entire House. So that's where I came from. And what you find the problem is the people who are elected to office, both at the state legislative level across the country, research has shown, but also especially in the Congress, which was my experience, they are not representative of the country as a whole. They are representative, by and large, of the extremes of each party, of the far right and the far left. So most people in the country don't populate, just philosophically, don't populate the extremes. They don't wake up every day thinking, what's my congressman doing in Washington? They wake up every day thinking, how are the Gators going to do in basketball this week? What does my class or work schedule look like? What are my kids' activities for the week? That's what they're thinking about. But the people who do wake up every day, living and breathing politics, thinking about what's happening in Washington and what's my congressman doing today, those are the people that put up yard signs and walk the precincts and knock on doors and show up at town hall meetings and call the congressman's office to voice their opinion. And most importantly, those are the people who vote in primaries. So if you're running for office in that system, you have to appeal to the people who are voting, and the people who are voting are on the extremes. The Pew Research Center, and everything I'm talking about is covered in the book, if you're interested. And we're going to have a Q&A, but if you have a burning question you want to stop me, please feel free to do so. I'll be happy to answer something on the fly, too. But the Pew Research Center in 2017 did what they do every 3 years, a political typology study, and they ranked people based upon their politics. They asked them questions, and they created sort of this metric of here's where the country is politically. And what they found was about 30% of the country populates the political extremes, the far extremes, approximately 15% with liberal and conservative. So the rest of the country, 70%, they're more populated moving towards the center. And they asked them different questions. And one of the questions that they asked them was, what's your definition of compromise? That 30% populating the extremes, they answered that question. Their definition of compromise was, my side wins. The other 70%, their definition of compromise was the other side gets at least as much or more than my side. Very different. And that's the problem. It's the people on the far extremes that are electing our leaders in this country. And as the Pew survey showed, it's that 30% that are the most active, engaging in all those activities that I told you about, and the people who vote in primaries, who dominate the vote in primaries. So again, if you're running for office, you want to stay in office, you have to appeal to that group. So we have a lot of things that have led us to that circumstance. And we have waves periodically. We had one in 2006 where the Democrats came in. We had one in 2010 where the Republicans took control. We may be facing one in 2018. It certainly looks that way, that it's building up. But what happens is the pendulum swings back and forth. And by and large, it's the centrists that get wiped out. And right now in Congress, we have only a relative handful of people that are legitimately centrist, willing to work with both sides, willing to vote against their leadership, willing to accommodate other points of view, compromise and get things done. And that's what the American people, the majority of the American people want. They want a functioning government. We may or may not shut the government down tomorrow for the first time since 2013. They want a government that can function, a Congress that can compromise, accommodate different points of views, that can get along and get things done. That's not what the people on the extremes want. The people on the extremes, as the Pew Research Center showed, want their side to win. That's what's most important. And when you're a centrist in that environment in Congress, you learn pretty quickly that that's the dynamic. Compromise has become a dirty word in Washington. When you are noticed as somebody who is willing to talk to the other side, who's willing to co-sponsor other bills from people on the other side, who's willing to vote against your leadership. When you're tagged as somebody who's a compromiser, that's viewed as a weakness. Compromise in political circles is often viewed as somebody, they don't have a backbone. They won't take a stand. They're wishy-washy. They're in the middle. And when you go into a primary, as I found out, that's not a winning proposition, because they will point to you and say, that guy or that woman works with the other side. They're not on our team. They actually like to talk to the other side, and that's viewed as a negative. So that's why we don't have a lot of centrists in Congress, and that's the fundamental problem that I try to address in the book. Why are we electing people who are not representative of the people in the country? They're representative of the extremes. And that's what the data has shown. That's not just anecdotal evidence. That's what the data has shown. So in the book, I do a few things. I have psychological and scientific research on the way partisans think. Really interesting studies on cognitive bias and how how people just seek out information that reaffirms their own point of view. How do they react in group dynamics when you show them information that conclusively proves their point of view is wrong? Factual evidence that their core beliefs are just inaccurate. How do they react? And I think you can probably guess how they act. So I'll get into some of those. And then I talk about the issues that are commonly thought to lead to polarization in Washington and in our state legislatures. And that is gerrymandering, campaign finance, money in politics, the partisan media, Fox News and MSNBC, and wherever you are in the political spectrum, right? What's the impact of that? And I talk about the systemic issues like closed primaries where the extremes dominate what I'm talking about. I talk about systemic issues within the legislatures themselves, how the Senate and the House operate, and the rules and how they lead to polarization. So I look at all of that. And then throughout I weave experiences from my career as a centrist in Congress, talking about the real world impact. Here's somebody that's legitimately wrapped up and caught up in this whole thing, and how is it affecting my decisions, both at home in dealing with my constituents, but also in Washington and having to deal with my party leadership and members on the other side of the aisle. And the last chapter is solutions, what we can do about it. And there are solutions, there are ways out of this to move towards electing more people, because that's my premise. And the facts, the research has shown this. When there are more centrists in Congress, more bills get passed, more work gets done, more things happen. It's a more functioning body. It's a more functioning government, the more centrists that are there. So that's my premise, is we need to elect more people who are more representative of the country as a whole rather than the extremes. So when you look at cognitive bias and the way partisans think, this is the crux of the whole thing. And this is why, to cut to the chase on some of these solutions, you're not going to change people's minds. You're not going to get the 15% far left and the 15% far right to change their way of thinking and to start supporting moderate centrists. That's not how it works. So there's a lot of examples in there of group dynamics and bias. And I talk about social media and the impact, Twitter and Facebook. And you have these now, as you all know, the search engines will customize to give you more of what you want and what you've been searching for. So you have this filter bubble that exists. Google and Yahoo will, when you search for things, they'll give you more of what you want. The Facebook news feed does the same thing. Twitter will do the same thing for you. And the best one to look at is YouTube. If you go on YouTube and you search for Elvis Presley is still alive, or 9/11 was an inside job, or the moon landing was filmed in a television studio, you will find videos that purport to show you evidence of those things being true. And guess what shows up on the right side for your recommended viewing list? More of the same. And over time, you will come to believe that that's the only point of view because that's the only thing that you see. And that's an extreme example, but that's the way it works. And as many people watch hours of YouTube per day in this country as watch hours of television. More people get their news from Facebook than any other source in the country. So when Facebook customizes the search in the same way that I described, and your news feed is based upon showing you more of what you like and less of what you don't like, that's what happens. And with regard to Twitter, there have been a lot of studies on people. Of course, Twitter is like social engagement, and people in society surround themselves generally with people who think like they do. They move into locations, and we have the sorting of Americans. There's a great book called The Big Sort, if you've read it, that talks about how people move into areas and they surround themselves with people who think like they do, both politically and the way they operate in society, and their social circles reaffirm their beliefs. Well, Twitter does the same thing, and there was a study done of Twitter users where they had 10,000 Twitter users, and they studied their partisan activities. And people delete and surround them. They delete people who disagree with them, and they surround themselves with people who agree with them. But there was a difference between Republicans and Democrats in the language that they used. It became very obvious what side people were on politically. Republicans used more terms, we and us, and they focused more on the group setting. Democrats used terms I and me in much more expressive terms, including sometimes more swear words, for example, but more emotion in their tweets. Democrats had more, the Republicans' alternative to politics were things like religion and things that you could probably surmise. Democrats got into sports and the arts and things like that. But when they were focused on politics, the language that they used, it was very easy to tell if they were Republican or Democrat. And it's not about using the term Obamacare or talking about Benghazi and trying to figure out. It was the actual language that they used in everyday conversation. There's a phenomenon known as blind sharing. All of you who are on social media probably every day see multiple articles that your friends forward around, presumably to show off their newfound intelligence and show everybody how smart they are. So there was a study done on people who share articles and how many actually read the article before they shared it. And they found, studying thousands of sharings, 59% of articles that are shared are not clicked on. They're not read before they're shared. People read the headline and then moving on because they think that they already are educated. And the problem that you have with partisans is partisans believe they have all the answers, both Republican and Democrat. If you were given the name and a picture of somebody, do you think that you could say with certainty how they would behave under certain circumstances? Maybe not. There was a study done of a focus group between two groups. One was allowed to interview the people in the picture, actually engage with them and ask them questions. The others just had the picture. And of course, the people who had interviewed the people in the pictures were much more accurate in guessing how people would behave. But what's scary is both groups had almost the same certainty that they were right, that they would get it right. Even though people had very little information to work from, they were sure that they already knew the answer. There was a study done by the University of Illinois on welfare programs, social welfare. And they asked people questions, factual detail. How many people are on welfare? What's the income threshold to qualify? How long can you be on it in your lifetime? What's the family coverage? If you have a job, can you qualify? Different things like that. Medicaid, food stamps, all these programs. So there's factual questions. And they ask people after they have taken the test, did you pass? After they took it. 89% said, yes, I passed. 83% failed. No, that's a different one, which I'll tell you about. 3% of the welfare study, 3% got more than half the questions right. 3% got more than half the questions right. Now, those are hard questions, right? You heard the questions. But what they found was the people who did the worst on the test were the people who were most certain that they were right. And it was proportional. So you have that issue. There's the one I was going to tell you about was a Revolutionary War exam. And this gets into how uneducated people are on civics and the history of the country and democratic ideals. And the Constitution Center in Philadelphia did a study, and they asked people, the first question was, do you think you could pass a test of the common facts about the American Revolution? Commonly known facts of the American Revolution. 90% said yes. They took the test and 83% had failed. About a third could not place the revolution in the right century. Now, it's a little bit of a trick question. It's the 18th century, not the 17th century. But nonetheless, very poor results on that. C-SPAN did a study on the Supreme Court last year, 2017. They asked 1,034 people to name as many members on the Supreme Court as they could. And less than half of Americans can name even one member of the Supreme Court. Of 1,034 people that were surveyed, none could name all 9. 0. And in a different survey related to the Supreme Court, 10% of Americans believe that Judge Judy is on the Senate. These are the people that are electing our leaders. When given a yes or no question, half of Americans did not know that Herbert Hoover was a president. 75% of Americans don't know how many members of the U.S. Senate there are or how long a senator's term is. And again, it's often the people who are the least informed that are the most certain of their opinion and are the most politically active. This is the problem that we have. So it's one of the reasons that I talk about the Bob Graham Center and the great work that's being done here. When you get into cognitive bias, it really becomes evident when you look at the way people's brains react under different circumstances. And some of the most interesting examples that I cited in the book involve those types of studies. There was one in 2004 in October, right before the presidential election, very heated, Bush versus Kerry, very partisan, and they got people from the extremes, and they put them under an MRI, and they watched their brain waves while they were watching information about the two candidates. And they had 2 videos that they would show to get people's juices flowing, right? And they made the candidates made themselves look very bad. They got themselves into a predicament, which I'll give you an example. But in the end, it turns out okay. So you see the emotions of people as their adversaries are in this position, and then their own candidate. And the example with President Bush is they show him in 2000 when he's running for president, standing next to Ken Lay, if you remember, former CEO of Enron. And he points to him and he says, Ken Lay is one of my best friends. He's the best businessman in America, and if I'm elected president, I'm going to run the country the way Ken Lay runs Enron. That was the first clip. Second clip, they show Ken Lay in the orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed behind his back, walking into the courtroom. They explained that Enron went bankrupt. We had to change the laws of the country because they were so corrupt to make sure that that never happened again, and he died in jail. So President Bush not looking so great so far. And then the third clip is him while he was president saying, he fooled me, and I'm going to make sure that he probably fooled you, and I'm going to make sure this never happens again. I'm going to take action to make sure that nothing like this ever happens. So he comes out looking okay in the end. And they had a similar example with Kerry, with the ups and downs. And what they found in monitoring the brain waves of partisans through this is, if it was your candidate that was in bad position, people got scared and nervous and thinking about how am I going to get out of this? And if it was the other candidate, most alarmingly, there was glee and joy, and the brain actually gave a little hit of dopamine when that happened. And that's why partisanship is actually addicting when that happens. And that study's by a guy named Drew Weston from Emory University, if you want to look that up. But on the negative side, the part of the brain that never lit up at any point in that process was the part of the brain that deals with rational thought and reasoning, and maybe I'm not right about this guy. Maybe there's more to the story. That never happens. It's all about defense and glee when it's the partisans. So that becomes a big problem. There was a study done about math and people's ability to do common math problems when partisan issues are involved. So there was the first group, there's a focus group, and they separate people based upon their partisanship and their math skills. And they gave them a skin cream analogy, where you have a focus group that everyone has a rash, and there's a focus group that takes the skin cream, and there's a focus group that does not get treated, and the percentage that gets better and the percentage that gets worse. And you do the math. Does the skin cream work? And you get the answer, and people got the answer right exactly in proportion to their math ability, as you think about it. Then they had the exact same data, same setup, focus group, one participated, one didn't, same numbers, This time the question was about gun control. And it was communities that have implemented gun control laws. One group of communities did, one group didn't. In some cases, crime went up. In some cases, crime went down. Do gun control laws work? People couldn't get the question right. If it coincided with their own political point of view, they got it right. If it went against their political point of view, and the people who were giving the test knew the political point of view, so they would test both ways, they refused to believe it. They got the question wrong. Even if their math ability was high, and they clearly knew the answer, mathematically, it was right in front of them, they couldn't bring themselves to saying that that was a problem. So that's what we're dealing with partisans. There was a test of a guy named Dan Ariely, who is a famous psychological researcher, behavioral psychologist at Duke University. And he chose Pittsburgh to do a study because Pittsburgh has two schools right next to each other. Carnegie Mellon University, one of the premier math and science private university math and science schools in the whole world, 9% acceptance rate, very exclusive, next to the University of Pittsburgh, which is a fine school, but different, right? Not the same type of academic pedigree that CMU has. And there's a little bit of a rivalry that exists between the two, especially at CMU, sort of questioning the academic credentials of their neighbors in Pittsburgh. So Professor Ariely picked a group of math students at CMU and incorporated one actor, and they were given 30 math questions and 30 minutes to answer the questions, and they would be paid for each question they got right. The actor openly cheats in front of everybody, quickly finishes the exam, turns it in, gets paid for all 30 questions, and walks out. The CMU students look at him. Most of them decided, well, if this guy got away with it, I'm going to do it too. And they cheated, and they walked out, and they got paid. Then he did the exam, same scenario, same actor. This time, the actor's wearing a University of Pittsburgh shirt. Cheats, walks out, gets paid. The CMU students look at him, they don't cheat, and they look down. And they asked the students afterwards, why didn't you cheat? And they said, because we don't do that here. We're CMU. That's not what we do. That's Pitt. They do that kind of stuff across the street. So the issue is group dynamics, right? People want to be a part of a group. There was a study that showed strips of paper, one of which was clearly longer than the other. They had a group of actors with a larger group. The actors, by arguing forcefully and agreeing with each other that all the strips actually were the same size, it's just an optical illusion, got 3/4 of the other people to agree with them because they wanted to conform with the group. That was more important to them than giving accurate information. So this is the kind of thing that drives public policy, because you have people that are biased in that way that are making decisions. There was a study about a doctor's waiting room, and you put magazines in front of people with a partisan tilt to them, but you change the articles inside to be on the other side of the politics, right? You have a Republican magazine, a Democratic magazine, but you fill them with the opposite party's material. But you don't change the byline, so it appears that they're reading a magazine, they select their own party, and it appears they're reading their own material, but they're not. They're reading the other side's arguments. And then when you ask them afterwards, do you agree with that argument, they will say yes, because they think it came from their side. If you show people the academic pedigree of researchers and people who have put forward studies on political issues, hot button issues like climate change and gun control and nuclear energy, and you show them the study, if you don't show them the study, they'll say, yeah, that looks like a pretty good pedigree, and that sounds like they know what they're talking about. And then you show them the study. If it doesn't agree with them, they will downplay the credentials of the people who wrote the article, the people who did the research. They won't even believe their own credibility, let alone the issue that they've written. So this is the type of thing you have to deal with cognitive bias. When you look at the different issues regarding gerrymandering and campaign finance and partisan media, it becomes alarming when you think about, with regard to the media, 2011, Fairleigh Dickinson did a study where they tested the factual knowledge of people who got their news primarily from MSNBC or Fox News. They took both. And they found that the people who got their news from those two outlets were less informed than people who didn't pay attention to the news at all, and much less informed, overwhelmingly less informed than people who got their news primarily from the Sunday shows, which most people would agree are more neutral in their presentation. So that's part of this issue too. When the Pew Research Center did this study too, a study of media usage, and when you ask partisans where they get their news from, they asked Republicans and they asked Democrats, and the Republicans said, and they eliminated anything that didn't get 5%, right? So there were other answers, but if it didn't get at least 5% of the response, it was eliminated. So the Republicans ended up with 4 places where they said they got their news. I should say conservatives, not just Republicans. Fox News, and then 3 of the major radio folks, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck. The Democrats had 9 sources where they got their information from: BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, the national news programs, network news programs. But the real issue is that that's 13 different news sources and there was no overlap. The two sides are getting their news from 2 completely different sources, reporting completely different information. So again, if you surround yourself with that information and that's all you're hearing, you're going to believe it. And the issue has become with voting participation as it relates to that. A lot of you will remember, in the 70s, starting in the late 70s, certainly the early 1980s, about 1982, we started to get more channels, more cable channels arrive. But before then, you basically had the 3 network channels. So if you wanted to watch The Wheel of Fortune at 7:30, you had to sit through Walter Cronkite, John Chancellor, or David Brinkley to get there, because we didn't even have remote controls. You had to get up off the couch to change the channel. And people, even if they weren't interested in the news, or they didn't want to watch the news, they sat through it. And they absorbed that information because they were waiting for what's on the other side. The same concept from the 1940s and 30s when they had the newsreel at the movie theater, where you had to sit through the news update to get to the movie. And what they found in looking back at that, voting participation was much higher among the group that watched the news before they got to Wheel of Fortune or whatever the 7:30 show was, because they were more interested and more knowledgeable about current events. Well, today, because you have 300 channels and you can watch anything that you want, and you have an internet with limitless information, people who aren't interested in the news are never exposed to it. They're watching the Kardashians or a home improvement show or The Simpsons, and they're online looking at whatever they're looking at online, but it's not the news, and therefore they don't vote. They don't participate. And because they don't participate, they leave the task of electing our leaders to people on the far extremes. This is the issue that we have to deal with. So when you look at gerrymandering, which is a topical issue because you probably saw a federal court struck down the lines that were drawn in North Carolina. There are 2 cases pending in the U.S. Supreme Court, and it is very likely, most people agree, they're going to strike partisan gerrymandering. Hopefully that will be the case. If that happens, you'll have lines drawn by independent commissions. You won't have political leaders choosing their voters, as is currently the case. You'll go back to a system where voters choose their political leaders, which I think most people would agree is more fair. I'm someone who lost my seat primarily because of gerrymandering. My seat was eliminated. So I went into writing the book, which was a 2-year process, thinking this is a really big problem because I've seen it and it's affected me. But what you find is it's really just a symptom. And solving that problem does not solve polarization, because the whole thing rests with primaries. And even if you have a district that is 50-50, Because I think that's most people's ideal, right? You draw a district that's half Republican and half Democrat, and there'll be a lot of turnover, and whatever side wins, wins. And theoretically, you'd have more people that are moderate because they have to be accountable to both sides, but that's actually not what happens in practice. What happens in practice is both of those sides, the R's and the D's, have to have primaries to nominate their candidates. And as a result, those primaries still nominate people on the extremes for the reasons I told you. So even if you have a 50-50 district, you get two candidates that are representing the far extremes, and then the people who show up in the general election say, why are these my two choices? Why do I have to pick between far right and far left? Where's my centrist choice? In Florida, a quarter of the voters are non-party affiliation. They can't vote in primaries. And those aren't all people in the middle, to be fair. Many of them are. Some of them left their party because their party wasn't extreme enough for them, so they left to move towards the extreme. But by and large, those are people who would, in all likelihood, bring a voting pool to the center where they're able to vote in primaries. So even if you solve gerrymandering, you don't solve that problem. So I'm going to take questions after I tell you this, so think about the questions. In California, they instituted what's called a top two primary. They did two things after the 2010 census. They moved their gerrymandering, redistricting process to an independent commission, and they went to a top two process. And what that means is when you run in the primary, everybody's in the same voting pool. In the primary, Republicans and Democrats and Greens and Libertarians and Independents and everybody under the sun, and you're all there together, and all the voters are eligible to vote, all registered voters, in that primary. Now, if you're a candidate running for office in that system, guess what? If you're only appealing to a narrow extreme in your own party, you are not going to win, which is totally different than a closed primary. You have to appeal across the spectrum, not just to your own party, but to centrists and even members of the other party. And when the top two go to the general election, sometimes they're the same candidate. Louisiana has a similar system. They have a runoff that happens after the general, but an open general election. And same deal. Sometimes it's the same party. But when there's a reporter named George Skelton in the Los Angeles Times who wrote an article on the impact of those two reforms together in California, redistricting reform and the primary. The candidates have moved much more to the center. It has worked. It has moderated what's happening in both Sacramento and in the congressional district. When they redrew the lines, the gerrymandering reform, the independent commission, they drew competitive seats. Now there's 55 congressional seats in California. And because of the sorting that I told you about, you can't draw competitive seats in every region. But they drew 13 seats that are legitimately competitive, that are toss-ups that could be won by either party. And you might say, well, 13 out of 55 doesn't sound like very much. Until you consider, in the previous map that had been in effect for the previous decade, exactly 0 of the districts were competitive. And going back 20 years, the turnover that occurred between the parties, not just with a candidate being defeated, but even leaving office and then being replaced by somebody, almost never happened where it was somebody of a different party. And the replacement was almost always somebody more ideologically extreme than the person that they were replacing, of the same party. That all changed. So now in California, if you want to run and keep your seat, you have to moderate your message. And if you don't do that, you lose. So they've had a lot of incumbents that have been knocked out of office. You saw maybe Congressman Darrell Issa, a firebrand Republican, very conservative Republican, moderated his rhetoric and his voting record to some extent. For example, he voted against a tax bill, which he never would have done in the previous system. Finally made the determination that he wasn't going to be successful next year, and he retired from office. And I don't say that in a partisan way, but that is an example of how somebody on the extreme could not survive in that current system. And the same thing has happened with Democratic members, both at the state legislative level and at the federal level. So people who did continue in office became more moderate. The people who didn't lost and were replaced by people who were more moderate. I think that is a lesson that we can take from all of this. So one of my key solutions is for the country to move to that type of system where your accountability as a candidate is more towards people in the center than people on the far extremes. And if you do that, you change the type of people we're sending to public office. They can work together, they can get along, and hopefully compromise a little bit more and get more done. So that's my opening remarks. But I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody has out there. But please go to the mic because we're being
Can
recorded.
I ask you, as you come forward, not to make speeches? We have a speaker. And also, if you would, be considerate of those who might want to follow you and ask a question. So ask one question, and if you have another one, let somebody else ask the question first. Thank you.
My name is Tom Lane. I have a lot of friends that believe that if we had elections, in the first ballot, if we had none of the above, along with the two candidates, and if the majority of the people voted none of the above, that would force either side to come up with another candidate. The second time, they couldn't have none of the above. But I think that would be a big improvement in this system where a lot of people come out and say, we're really disgusted with either one of these, none of the above.
I get into, in the book, ways we can increase voter turnout. And one of the things that people always point to is mandatory voting, like they have in Australia, where there's a penalty for not voting. You pay a fine if you don't vote. And in that system, you're given the choice, none of the above. Because in theory, if you're going to force people to vote, and they don't like anybody on the ballot, you should give them that choice. So certainly in that circumstance. Now, there are issues with mandatory voting as far as it being popular in this country. But I do think that you can use your voice in a variety of ways. But if it's just a partisan ballot, you're not going to see the none of the above issue on there. But you reminded me of one other thing I wanted to mention in relation to that. A question that comes up when I talked about increasing voter turnout and getting more centrists to vote. And I told you those are the people that don't pay as much attention to politics and don't watch the news religiously. So a question that always comes up, and I hope I'm not undercutting someone in line there, but is, well, shouldn't our elections be decided by people who care? And if you don't care enough to show up to vote, and you don't learn the issues, you've de facto forfeited your right as a citizen to vote and stay home. And let's let the people who know what they're doing vote. The problem with that is the people who show up to vote in that circumstance are the most biased. They have the most, that cognitive bias, all those examples. They score the worst on all of those exams, and they are the most immovable on their point of view, even if they are shown that they're factually incorrect. So if you just leave the voting process to that group of people, you're going to continue to get people onto the streets.
Thank you for your very thoughtful remarks. I'm Bob Holt, professor here at the university. And you spoke to the echo chambers that people tend to construct around themselves, where they hear mainly opinions that they already agree with, that just get amplified. If we went back a couple of generations to my father's generation, most of the men, at least, served in the armed forces, and they were forced to interact with people from many walks of life. And I felt that many people in that generation developed that kind of empathy with people from other livelihoods, from other parts of the country with different perspectives. I wonder if a structural change that might be advisable would be to have a national service requirement for all citizens of the U.S., where maybe after high school you spend a year or two being in the military, working in some government activity someplace, or something that throws people together from different backgrounds.
I think there's a lot to that, and I would support that. I don't get into that as a solution in the book to polarization, but I do think that exposure that would give someone, and not being so narrow and surrounded by people with the same point of view all the time and that are just like them in demographics and thinking like them, would be beneficial to the country. So I think that would be good.
Hi, I'm daughter of a German Catholic Holocaust survivor, so I paid attention to politics much of my life because I see what government can do. And I used to be a leftist, and I don't know if I want to, I call myself a constitutionalist, and I wonder where that fits in the spectrum between what you would think as defining left or right, because The centrists, I disagree about that. The things should be left to centrists because, as you say, they're so busy with their lives and they're not really paying attention. And if they are paying attention and they rely on the biased press, which does, if you would just give your thoughts on what I'm saying, that the press is ill-focused. They don't talk about the deeper issues. It's just the day-to-day headlines that waste a lot of our time and focus. For instance, David Rockefeller, in a video, thanked the leaders of the U.S. journalism and press, the New York Times, Washington Post, on, the big names, that they were not covering the secretive efforts toward globalization and against national sovereignty. He said, thank you for not covering this and keeping us out of the limelight for 40 years so we could proceed. So those are the things the press don't cover. So there is a deep state. And civics classes are rarely taught anymore at a time when 82% of the population of the United States are immigrants and their offspring from mostly third world countries. And most Americans went to government, or i.e. public schools. Therefore, they had bias indoctrination, which I've witnessed for sure. So.
Thank you for telling your story.
Well, I just wanted his comments on that those are the things that centrists, they have against them as far as like relying on them.
I want to thank you for telling your story because it's not easy to get up and tell your personal story, so thank you the way you opened. My definition of centrist is not they vote in the middle every time. My definition, when I talk about centrists and moderates and the way I try to conduct myself in Congress is you listen to both sides, you have a thoughtful approach, and you're open to different opinions. It doesn't mean you always vote right down the middle or you don't have your own opinions, but you're open to listening to other points of view. That is what's missing in Washington. So when I talk about centrism, that's what I'm talking about. People who are not just stuck on the party ideology and they're going to vote uniformly with the way their party leaders ask.
And weren't like only of the Revolutionary War, the ones that fought the Revolutionary War and that promoted the Revolutionary War against, for American sovereignty, weren't those considered extremists? There was only like 2 to 5% of the population that proceeded with that war. So they were considered extremists then.
Perhaps. Those were good folks. Founding fathers.
There are instances of bipartisanship in Congress, and I think it's important to highlight that. They don't often make it into the media, but when they do, I think it's important for us to share it. One example that comes to mind in the U.S. House of Representatives is the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, and it has equal number of Republicans and Democrats, and they are an active group, and they have been known to vote together, and often they have been voting against maybe their party leadership, and I think it's interesting and something that should be supported, and I was wondering if you could give your thoughts
I'm
about that.
glad you did. Yes, there are examples of where that happens. The problem is, and I don't know the membership of the caucus that you referenced, but I bet it doesn't equal 218 members, which is what it takes to pass a bill. So what you find with regard to real centrists who are willing to listen on all issues, it's a relative handful. On an issue like climate change, you probably can get more because that's one issue. But if you don't get to the critical mass of being able to actually pass legislation over the desire of your party's leadership, then you haven't accomplished it yet. But it's a good thing, what you mentioned. I'm glad that group exists, and I'm glad there is collaboration. I talk in the book, there's been some talk about how members don't get along anymore, and Republicans and Democrats don't socialize, and they're not friends, and there's animosity. That's part of the reason there's polarization. What I found in my own experience, but also in researching, is that's absolutely not true. Republicans and Democrats are friends. They do socialize together. You do build across-the-aisle friendships. Doesn't mean you vote together. You still retreat to your corners when they ring the bell, but you're friends. There was an American University professor named Jennifer Lawless. This is an awesome study. It came out in 2016. She studied 40 years of votes, congressional votes, votes on amendments, co-sponsorships of bills, and members traveling together overseas. Over 9,700 examples of these congressional delegations, bipartisan travel, which is where you build these friendships, these long overseas trips where you're spending time together. And what she found was, to the surprise of many, but not a surprise to me, is friendships don't mean anything. Friendships don't mean less polarization. Friendships mean you're friends, but it doesn't change your voting record in any way.
Good evening. Excuse me. I'm a student at the University of Florida here, and I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the impact of political polarization in America is having and will continue to have on sort of the young people, the millennial vote, especially considering what you mentioned about social media and news from that, and even looking around here, most of the people here are not young students.
Yeah, I noticed that. Being on campus of 40,000 people or more. Thank you for coming and thank you for that question. This is not, you asked what I think, so my answer is not what I think. It is what is known to be true, and it's alarming, and that is that millennials, a good thing about millennials, a great thing, is by all accounts in the aggregate, they're very socially conscious. They care about their communities, they care about people around them, they want to be active, and they want to make a difference. Often to a higher degree than generations that came before them. Certainly the generations that came immediately before them, that is the case. The problem is they don't see politics as the solution. They don't see politics as a path to making that change. And that means not only that they're not running for office, and they're not positioning to run for office, they don't think that that is a way that they can make social change. They're not voting as much as they should. They're not participating in campaigns in other ways. And if you leave that out, again, you're leaving the chore of electing our leaders to the far extreme. So I would hope the millennials would, and boy, in today's Washington and world, regardless of your politics, how could you not be disenchanted with what you see? How could you not want to walk away from it? But if the millennials continue to have that view that politics is not the way to make a difference and political engagement doesn't matter, you're going to still see more of the same. So I would hope they would reconsider.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. I'm a retired Marine Corps officer, so Professor Holt, I want to thank you for your comment because I know that my personal belief system was moderated by my experience. I was Hatch Act restricted, so I didn't have a right to a public opinion, but privately most of us knew where we came from, but we, much like your story about getting along, the two best friends on the Supreme Court a few years ago were Ginsburg and Scalia, because they were both grandparents and loved opera and respected each other, but they clearly didn't vote together. I actually had the chance to interview on the radio a few months ago. I was living in Southern California in the heart of the 49th District.
Oh, that's you.
That is me.
Oh, hey.
I have a face for radio, so. And it was very interesting you mentioned ISA. It was very interesting you mentioned the open or the jungle primary where the top two end up coming out. Because there are 5 declared Democrats in that race right now. And they were all planning to take on ISA. And what that's done is created an opening for Republicans again. Otherwise, the Democrats have to get together and figure out who's the most moderate, who can win. Because if 5 split 60% and 2 split 40%, you could still end up in that case. I'm going to land the plane because I know you want a question, but I'm not here to give a speech. I'm Floridian. I was born in Florida. I love Florida. I've lived all over the country, all over the world. I came back to Florida. What can we do to get to an open primary? Because of everything else you mentioned in this wonderful book, I think one of the things that would have the highest yield, unless I'm mistaken, would be an open primary. I watched my dad change his registration back and forth to vote for Bob Graham or vote for someone else as a young man. So I had a great example of my father, someone who was willing to change the registration for a primary to influence the vote. But most people right now would be benefited by an open primary.
It's important to point out open primary does not mean independents can choose one or the other and vote in that primary. And it certainly does not mean Republicans can vote in Democratic primaries and vice versa, because that leads to mischief where you vote for the weaker candidate because that gives your guy a better chance, or woman a better chance to win. It's not what an open primary. Open primary is everybody's in the same primary. There's one primary and all the parties are in it. And as I talk about, that has a great moderating influence. The process is this is the case with campaign finance reform and institutional reforms in Congress, or whatever you want to look at. Members of Congress are not going to vote against their own self-interest. They are not going to change the rules in a way that's going to make their own election more competitive. They got a pretty good thing going right now, and they don't want to change. So you're not going to see state legislatures pass this. You're not going to see Congress pass this because it would affect them. The way you do it is through referendums. The states that have done it, like California, do it through public referendum. We live in a state, I live in Jacksonville, by the way. We live in a state where we have that process, a referendum. And there is a group, it's called Open Primaries, if you want to Google them. And there's a Constitutional Review Commission that's going on now too, so there's a unique opportunity to have your voice heard by them. If they're not interested, you can circulate signatures, get enough signatures, get it on the ballot, and then you'd have the process of the referendum. But that's the only way it's going to happen, because individual legislators are not going to vote for it.
Hello, my name is Trevor Poppy. I am a freshman here at the University of Florida, and I just turned 18, so I haven't been able to really participate in politics that much yet. So I just wanted you to elaborate on how you were able to stay a centrist for so long in Washington, and how you were able to see both sides equally and keep your bias, if you have any, probably not completely out of all the business that you guys did.
What's your first name?
Trevor.
Thank you, Trevor. And you all think that I set Trevor up for this question. But thank you for that question. I would say, as it relates to me, there were two things going on. One is that just really is philosophically where I am. That's just my core. I want to work and get along and compromise. I came from that background. You don't survive in Congress very long that way. But again, I also represented a district where I heard both sides. I heard different points of view. And every vote that I cast, I knew I was going to make half my district angry, and I was going to make half my district happy. And the trick to long-term survival in that is you don't want to repeatedly offend the same group over and over, right? You want to mix it up a little bit. So there's a trick to it. But eventually, it catches up to you in primaries. And again, my seat was eliminated, so that was a big part of it too. But you can get elected as a centrist, but it's not, the long-term survival is not usually the case, unfortunately, because you run into the partisan activists who go to primaries.
Hello, I'm Alan Sorrell. I'm a new college student up here working on my thesis. And in our classes, we learned about different competing political science models of voters. You talked a little bit about polarization. I think an idea of where you are on that. But in terms of how voters operate, I wondered how you thought about them as an elected official, if you gave more weight to the spatial model or the Columbia model, the Michigan model, and what advice you would have for, say, some of the gubernatorial candidates in 2018. Sometimes I worry that they give too much weight to one particular model over another.
So thank you for the question. It's a really good question. I don't want to get too academic-y, because there are all students in the audience. But it used to be when you ran for office, before polarization started to get so extreme, that you would try to appeal to the median voter, the centrist voter. That's when you wanted to win. Well, now that's not what you do. You appeal to the people on the extremes, as I talked about, which is a huge difference. And that affects the way people position themselves when they run for office. So, my advice is that if you want to win, and we have a primary, especially on the Republican side, in the governor's race, regardless of your politics, where there's a pretty clear dynamic that appears to be viewing between somebody who is more of a moderate, centrist, mainstream Republican, and someone who's definitely trying to appeal to that far extreme. And we'll see how that plays out. But usually in that dynamic, I'm not saying that will be the case in this race, when it's the people who are on the extremes that show up to vote, it's the candidate who can appeal to them that's going to win.
Well, I know you were talking about that with the primaries real quick, and I promise I won't ask more than one question there, but in terms of the general election, how do you think that will play out?
Well, what happens in the general election is all of those NPA voters, non-party affiliation voters, show up, the people who didn't show up in the primary, and if they're presented with people on the extremes, which often they are, they're going to be disappointed. So once you've won the primary, it's common to then try to come back, especially in a purple state like Florida, where you do kind of have to appeal to a wider base. This year, 2018, is going to be different because it appears there's a lot more enthusiasm on the Democratic side, and to the degree there will be a wave, that's going to influence some of these things. You have a growing Hispanic community here in Florida, folks coming from Puerto Rico, for example, in the Orlando area. So all of those things are going to play a difference in the way candidates position themselves. But definitely you have to start to move towards the center in a state like Florida. If you live in Oklahoma or Massachusetts or Oregon or Montana, not necessarily the case, right? You can keep doing what you're doing, but in Florida, you definitely have to come back to the center.
Thank you.
Let's make these the last two questions if we could. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm a first-year master's student in the political campaigning department. And my question had to do with how much you believe is the partisanship related to institutionalism versus agency. So what I mean by that is you already talked about some solutions, and jungle primaries. Some people argue that we should expand the number of seats in Congress, stuff like that. But at the same time, it seems like there aren't so many public figures that are willing to cross boundaries publicly and side with people they disagree with. And I was reading in another book about polarization, the Second Civil War, about FDR when he was appointing his cabinet, and how many Republicans at the time, even though he had an overwhelming amount of support from his party, still crossed that boundary and appointed Republicans to his cabinet. And even further back, probably in the least democratic time in our country at the beginning, when only white men could vote, still John Adams and Thomas Jefferson completely disagreed on whether it's a federal or anti-federal system, but they still got along. And so I'm curious what you think about that. And on a more lighthearted note, what's your favorite place to eat on Capitol Hill? Because I like the Library of Congress because the view is really nice. The cafeteria at the top.
Awesome.
Right. Thank you.
So wait, don't
Okay.
so condense your question. What was
Sure.
the first
So,
question you want me to
do you think that the solutions to the partisan problem have to come primarily from, initially, I guess it's a chicken and egg question, but in an institutional fashion, that we need to make changes to the way we vote, the way districts are drawn, gerrymandering, money in politics, or does it start with, people in government crossing those boundaries and saying, I understand what my leadership wants, I'm going to vote against them because it's the right thing to do to make compromise?
Thank you. On the Capitol Hill eating, I'm a little out of practice on eating on Capitol Hill.
Okay.
So you caught me off guard with a question, so I can't think of my favorite place right away. But there's a lot of things I didn't cover that I talk about in the book because this is a shorter forum. But one of the things I didn't talk about is income inequality, which rises and falls with polarization in almost perfect synchronicity. The first 50 years of the country, when we were having less polarized income inequality, was narrowing, and then now it's growing in polarization. So there's a debate in the academic community about which is causing which, right? Is polarization the cause? You could make an argument either way. So that said, I think there's a lot of ways that you can look at the solution that you talked about, like which is the chicken and an egg. But the key to the whole thing is it is not going to fix itself. And if we keep doing what we're doing, if we continue to allow the extremes to dominate the election process, we're going to continue to get candidates who represent the extremes. And they're out of step with the majority of Americans. That's the fundamental problem that led me to write the book, is the people who are representing us. I don't say that they themselves are extreme, but they're accountable to the extremes. Their jobs depend on appealing to the ideological extremes. And that's going to continue to be the case until we institute these reforms of the process that moderate the people who vote.
Thank you.
All right, that's one.
Hi, my name is Taryn. I'm a second-year political campaigning graduate student. And my question is a little more geared towards campaigning and elections. First, I want to say I really love your definition of centrist. I like the fact that you emphasize the fact that you're not wishy-washy on your positions, but you have an open mind to both sides. So when you're in a swing district of whatever size the election might be in, like you ran in, what is a good campaign strategy in the primary portion when it is only extreme or polarized voters that are coming to the polls?
That is a great question. And again, if that's the only people who are going to come to the polls, then you have to appeal to them to have a chance to win. In my case, I had a unique circumstance because I had an incumbent that I was running against that was very popular and perceived to be invincible. So nobody really paid attention to the primary on the other side because they thought it was irrelevant, that the incumbent was just going to be whoever emerged from the primary. I tell an anecdote in the book to political campaigning. When you are elected, you come to the orientation right after the election. So you're meeting for the first time all of the people from across the country who won their congressional seats for the first time. And all the freshmen come together and you get to know each other and you meet some of your colleagues who've been there for a while. And I had one of them, a guy named John Barrow from Georgia, who was a Democrat, centrist, center-right, who represented a very conservative district in Georgia, but won as a Democrat, had held this seat. And he came and he introduced himself, and this guy's right out of central casting. He's a trial lawyer in Georgia with the big shock of white hair and speaks with a thick southern accent. He came up to me, he put his arm around me, and he said, "Son, let me give you some advice. There's a lot of people in this room and in the history of this house, there's a lot of people that got elected by accident. There were flukes." And I was thinking, well, where's he going with this? Right? And he looked around the room and he kind of focused on a few people and he looked back at me and he said, "But there ain't nobody in the history of the country that ever got reelected by accident." The point of that is all districts are different. And you might fluke your way in. And when you have waves like what may be coming here and happened in 2006, often that group doesn't last very long because some of them got in that maybe politically didn't deserve. They weren't good fits for the district, they're not great politicians, whatever the reason is. But in order to win and stay in office, you have to connect with your constituents. So yeah, winning a primary is part of that. But in my case and everyone's case, you still have to win the general. And if you position yourself in a primary in a way that's going to hurt you to the general electorate, you're not going to survive. Now, there's an alternative view of that, which is you can't win the general if you don't win the primary, right? So there's another chicken and egg. But the key is connecting with your constituents in whatever your district is. And when you campaign, it has to be authentic. They have to know that you're really taking a position that's you. And regardless of if they agree with it, that you're a decent human being that's going to morally represent the district, but more importantly, or equally important, that you are someone who believes what you're saying. And they can trust that when you go to Washington, you're going to act the way you say you're going to act. And if you do that, you can survive in the long term.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for having me.
We've got some books over here for sale. Dead Center is available. I'm sure Jason Altmire would like to continue the conversation, so if you want to buy a book and continue the conversation, I'm sure he'd be delighted. Let me thank you for being a great audience and Mr. Altmire for being a wonderful speaker with insight and thoughtfulness. Thank you very much.
There we go, bro.
Visit our neighbors.
Yeah, no place. It's exciting. Just getting back now. You got back.
Yeah, so the only remedy for the top two would be a write-in campaign. You know, a lot of times.
No, I think